Okay. Hi, everyone. Louise Schwarz, Recycling Alternative and Terraforma Systems. And it's interesting kind of coming between these two gentlemen, really talking about this, the impetus and the necessity of moving towards circularity. And then with Sam also talking about how to integrate new materials into our existing infrastructure and systems. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about meeting in the middle. And those of us who are on the front lines where these services and where the programs are delivered to the public and face the public, this is really that ability. We're looking at really how to bridge that gap, how to bridge those gaps between circularity and introducing new materials. So the system we have, of course, everybody's seen loads of pictures all day, but how I see it, how we see it is this way. In a way, our current system and existing infrastructure is built on these sort of building blocks. We've got these totes and containers. We've got these trucks and transportation. We've got tenants and user groups. And these are really the building blocks of our programs. And all of these activities on that front line are really about facilitating the flow of materials into consolidation and processing elements of this infrastructure to get to the markets. Because really, in this world, the journey is the destination. The markets is what we're moving towards. So the end goal is the markets. So we're always thinking about how we can work with these building blocks to get these materials to markets where they can then be made into new products. And that is the circular kind of imperative that we're working towards. Now, along with the infrastructure that we have existing on the front lines, the totes, the trucks, the tenants, the people, the users, we also have a number of tools that we use to help support this infrastructure in our path towards zero waste. And these are some of the tools we use. And I say zero waste because we're moving towards circularity. But in fact, if you look at many regions, many cities, already embedded in their strategies and goals for the regions are zero waste goals. City of Vancouver has zero waste 2040. The region has zero waste 2050. So this is already now, it's in writing. It's on record that this is how we're moving. And this aspect of the infrastructure, the tools that we are using, is everything from our bylaws and our bans to our MRFs, the system of MRFs that we have, new materials constantly coming into the system that we're having to look at and accommodate. And I think Sam will be talking about that, how we approach that within the existing infrastructure. We then have, of course, a very strong foundation of programs around EPRs and of course, the depot and network system, the ecosystem that is really the EPRs, the depots, et cetera. So we're constantly balancing out these tools with our infrastructure. And one of the things that happens is if we don't have these elements, if one of these elements, like the three-legged stool, starts to kind of falter, we get out of kilter with what we need to move the systems forward towards their markets. So, for example, some of us may remember, back in the day when GM, glass metal plastics was introduced and banned, and there was a bylaw that brought that in. In fact, things like there was a shortage of totes in the region. Suddenly everyone had to, we had to make sure every hauler had adequate totes to service this. Things like that happen. Things like in the past, and I think Cindy was talking about this a little bit, when our processing infrastructure needs to rely on external markets, when something like what was called the green wall or the green sword starts to look at not wanting materials being brought in from these jurisdictions, we have a problem because we're not able to move these materials through to the markets that we want to. Because at the center of this is always looking towards the markets. What is our end goal and what can we do? One of the things I can tell you that's happening right now in buildings is that because we're introducing more materials, which is excellent, there comes a point where we're having challenges with space, for example, at these buildings. In multifamily, you've got sometimes 500 units. How are we going to get all the totes in there? Are there better ways to be collecting and using our infrastructure? Is there a shift? Is there citizens wanting to start to opt out because it starts to get too complex and they want to look at something like single streaming, which is, of course, not really what we want if we're wanting to really look at our markets. So these are some of the things we have to consider when we're looking at our existing infrastructure. Now, the existing infrastructure is great. We need it. We're not going to throw it out. We need to start adapting it. And I think this has come up in a number of the conversations earlier in the day. So a few ways that Recycling Alternative, working within the system when you're talking about this kind of infrastructure, you can do tweaks. You can't change everything, but you can tweak it. And so, for example, this is some of the journey that we've been on as materials have expanded. The top is a 3-compartment truck that we started, my business partner designed when organics came into play, because suddenly we realized we were wanting to right size our own routing because the trucks were having to go out more frequently to collect organics because it's smelly, it's hard to manage. And we started to think, is there a better way to do this instead of sending these bigger trucks, that can take much more volume, but don't need to be there as often for the paper or the mixed containers. Of course, now they'd have to be there for the paper because packaging has exploded. Down from there, we looked at things with the city of Vancouver in areas where health and safety is a concern in some of the laneways down in the downtown east side, where the current system with bins and totes and dumpsters becomes a health and safety issue and can also be a litter issue. Was there another way to do this? In which case we would run the 3-compartment truck, and we also looked at partnering with some of the smaller collections to do bicycle collections. It won't work everywhere, but I'll tell you, something like an area like Yaletown in Vancouver that now is densely populated and very, very small in terms of access, we need to start thinking about that. Down at the bottom is one of our on-site composters from Terraforma, because organics, food waste is still a hassle to collect. It's great that we're collecting it, but it's heavy, it's wet, it's smelly. And so we started to look at how we could innovate in that particular space to manage more material on site and then collect only 20% of that in a dry form. Of course, underpinning all of this in the industry is transportation, the big elephant, the very expensive elephant in the room, which is the unpredictable escalating fuel costs. And so we're looking at electrification, but in 2003 and 2014, we were looking at recycled biodiesel and running the biodiesel co-op. And lastly, kind of coming full circle, now with this recent edition of the 4th, flexible plastics, we then really adapted that 3-compartment truck to look at a 4-compartment truck that could do in a single pass, pick up everything, the paper, the mixed containers, the glass, and the flexi plastics. And this was to work with those beautiful bright pink totes. So this is how we've tried to adapt and tweak certain elements in our journey. But really, what we've been talking about to date is the existing infrastructure and how it works right now. But where we're going next is digital. It's all about the data, baby, right? So, and it's come up in earlier conversations. People want reliable, traceable information that they can understand and that they can really utilize for all their reporting. So we've got this sort of physical infrastructure, we're tweaking it and working, but the next part of the journey is actually going to be quite a tall order. And this comes up in things like the plastics registries, even in the C&D that Paul and the group were speaking about this morning. So what people are wanting to understand now and what we're having to report on, materials transparency, traceability, the diversion metrics, real-time reporting. This came up, I think, with Tracy from Mission, talking about how can we get real-time, not just data reporting for my diversion, but I actually would like to have some real-time operational data reporting. What's going on with that truck out there in the field? And not least, the embedded education, because we've got to, at the end of the day, educate that other element of the sort of building blocks, which is the user group. So how do we do that? So this is really where the industry, we think, is having to go, is building and now kind of digitizing, dataizing. Now, so traditionally, if you think of the first slide I had, we had all the building blocks, everything feeding into the consolidation and the processing so that eventually we could get these materials to market for circularity and to make new products. What we need to start doing is that system's still critically important for the infrastructure, the foundations, but really what we need to start doing is a kind of paradigm shift in back to front thinking. We need to start thinking, where are the markets? What are the products we want to be making? And therefore, taking the step back from that, how do we therefore facilitate the building blocks and the tools? How are we going to collect this stuff? How are we going to transport this stuff? Because more trucks, more congestion, more GHGs, more escalating fuel costs is something that we've got to be thinking about. So how are we going to collect and consolidate? What does the processing look like? How can that create capacity regionally, if possible? And finally, what are the specs that ultimately those markets and those products want? And I think this came up when Eric was doing his talk earlier this morning about C&D, understanding what's the wood spec these guys want. Let's stop worrying about building the outside of the buildings. Let's do something inside that we can do. So what are the specs? And then from there, moving back to the very primary building blocks, which is the people that are using the systems on the front lines, how the materials are getting segregated, how they're getting transported, and how the users are using that. So this is how we think we've got to start looking at that back to front thinking to help now complement. And I've got to stop. So I'm just going to say finally, this is where the future infrastructure, this is what it will have to deliver. Definitely, it's not just material logistical, it's also about data and digital. It's adaptive, data-driven, and verifiably circular. People want that traceability. It's integrated and accessible. That means it's harmonized. It can also build capacity, not just in distributed models, that can also start to build that resilience and that capacity regionally. So I'll stop there because I've already been cut off.